Hi, everyone. This is Duncan Macklin with another Cyberskills Coach podcast. Today, I am speaking with Thomas Popik, Chairman and President of the Foundation for Resilient Societies. Thomas, welcome to the show. I'm very pleased to have you join me today to discuss some of the cyber threats facing the energy sector at large. So, huge welcome to you. Thank you for joining, sir.
Well, thank you very much, Duncan. I'm glad to be here.
Great. Now, Thomas, I've actually read the Resilient Society's mission statement on your website, and hopefully I'm summarizing it correctly, but I think it states that your mission is to protect critical infrastructure from disasters. So that being said, could we perhaps hear in your own words, maybe describing the day-to-day activities and what initiatives you're involved in currently?
Well, certainly. Let me take just a little bit of a step backwards, though, and talk about what kind of infrastructure we advocate to protect. And that's typically major infrastructure such as the electric grid, the telecommunications system. Those are probably the two most critical infrastructures. Of course, there's other infrastructures that are essential for daily life in the urbanized areas of the United States, water and sanitation being two additional infrastructures. So that's the infrastructure that's really important. And then what are the disasters or threats that we are concerned about? Well, we're not concerned about most weather-related threats. This would be even something like a hurricane or tornado. What we're concerned about are wide area infrastructure threats, and these would include things like cyber attacks, physical attacks, solar storms. Some of your audience may say, solar storm, what's that? Well, that's when the sun sends a mass of charged particles to the Earth and it deflects the Earth's magnetic field. That can cause a lot of effects in long-distance telecommunication systems as well as the electric grid. And then finally, a threat that is emerging, which is a nuclear electromagnetic pulse. And that would be if a foreign adversary were to detonate a weapon in the upper atmosphere, there would be a burst of an electromagnetic energy that would radiate downward and could affect sensitive electronics. And so that's a little bit of background in terms of the infrastructure that we believe should be protected and also some of the threats that we're concerned with.
Wow, that's certainly a lot to take in and obviously a lot to manage from a threat perspective. And it's interesting to hear how you're not so much regionalized, but really looking at the national scope and how things like a compromise of our entire internet infrastructure or our telecommunications, that's critical to our nation's security and, economic impacts, as a result of those types of situations from occurring. Myself as a member of the FBI InfraGard, whose mission is, to partner with the private sector to help protect and defend our nation's critical infrastructures, I certainly appreciate your efforts and applaud you and your team there in Nashua. Sorry about the groundhog seeing its shadow last week. You guys are going to have to endure another 6 weeks of winter up there, unfortunately. But myself being, based here in Houston, not only do I enjoy some fantastic weather, but also, we're kind of in the epicenter of our nation's energy production. And it's obviously of critical interest to a lot of those skyscrapers sitting in our downtown, skyline, all the oil and gas and energy, producing companies. Houston is the energy corridor of the United States. So I'm really hoping that, we're able to have some frank and open dialogue about, these cyber threats that are, of huge concern to the energy sector. And obviously a lot of this content that we're discussing today is going to be repurposed in a Houston Business Journal special edition magazine insert that is focused on the energy sector and going to press in production and release next week. So again, thank you for being here. So,
well, certainly, if I could just interject at this point and contrast the situations of Texas and New England, you're right. Texas is in the center of energy production, whereas we in New England are at literally the end of the pipeline. It's also cold here in New England. Just around the end of 2017, early part of 2018, we had a cold snap here in New England. What does that mean for critical infrastructure? Well, the natural gas that would ordinarily be used for electricity generation was instead used for home heating. What made up the difference? It was oil-fired generation plants. That oil, increasingly, it's difficult to deliver that oil, not only because of winter weather, but because the infrastructure for oil deliveries is being taken out of the system because less oil is being used. There's also environmental restrictions about oil-fired generation. Those oil-fired plants are in danger of being retired. And if we were just dependent on the natural gas, we would have had rolling blackouts here in New England. And so I just wanted to give a little bit of perspective to your audience and contrast your situation in Texas, which might be a little bit more fortunate in terms of energy security than the situation we have here in New England.
Wow, and that is a stark contrast, and thank you for sharing that information. It's obviously very insightful. So, kind of reeling things back into the cybersecurity and the threats that are going on today, I understand that your organization recently had some interactions with FERC, or the Federal Energy Regulation Commission, where you had submitted a request for changes to how the energy sector is handling and reporting these cyber incidents. Could you describe what motivated those actions and the filing of your petition?
Certainly. We have long-standing concerns about cybersecurity for what's called the bulk electric system. That's really the high voltage portion of America's electric grid. The current cybersecurity standards, which are developed by a private organization, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, and then approved by the regulator that you referred to, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, those cybersecurity standards are very weak. They're also incomplete. We've been observing this for years. What we noticed for several years in a row, the number of cybersecurity incidents reported by the electric utility industry to NERC and FERC, as they're called, was trivial. In some years, they'd be zero. In other years, just 2 or 3. At the same time, we have our federal government, the intelligence community, talking about how the electric grid is under cybersecurity threat, talking about how malware has been installed in the grid. And so we ask ourselves, how can this line up where on one hand, the industry is reporting hardly any cybersecurity incidents, yet our own federal government and the intelligence community is telling us we're at a dire risk through congressional testimony and other disclosures. We looked into this, and we decided that we would propose what's called a petition for rulemaking to FERC, which would initiate a revised standard that would require the electric utilities to take a much more assertive stance in terms of looking for malware that has made its way into both the business and the operational technologies of electric utilities, and then to report that malware, because if there isn't reporting, then there can't be an analysis of coincident types of malware, which would allow the malware to be more easily detected. So we really saw a very severe gap, and it was fully a year ago that we put this petition for rulemaking into FERC, as it's called.
Correct. And I actually have reviewed that petition in its entirety, and it was quite eye-opening to see some of the facts and figures that were presented, and some of the I guess discrepancy in the numbers, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But I want to go back to one of the points that you made about the bulk energy systems and the malware attacks that the intelligence community is aware of that potential. You know, the InfoSec community is very well aware of, let's, call out the example of the Ukrainian power system and the cyber attack that happened to it fairly recently. How likely do you think that type of attack is against the U.S. power grids?
Well, I think that we have to separate out the capability for the attack versus the likelihood of the attack. I think that a number of foreign adversaries are capable of attacking the U.S. electric grid, especially the bulk electric system. The likelihood is dependent upon a range of factors. This is where deterrence comes into effect. Released nuclear posture of the United States, U.S. were to experience a severe cyber attack, that our country could even retaliate with first use of nuclear weapons. I think that really shows how dire the situation is. We hope that a cyber attack, a severe cyber attack, is not likely, but I would say, based on testimony, congressional testimony, and other disclosures, the capability is there, and in the near term, there's a deterrence factor that protects us, but not necessarily good cybersecurity and the electric utility industry.
Fair enough. So, in your filing, Resilient Society stated, and I am quoting here, a simultaneous cyber attack on many low-impact assets may cause greater impact than an attack on a single high-impact asset. Why do you believe that is the case?
It's just a matter of the physics of the electric grid, as well as basic mathematics. So an attack on, say, a 1 gigawatt generation plant, that would be a contingency on a single 1 gigawatt generation plant. That would be a contingency that the utilities are well prepared for. There's enough spinning reserves to handle that kind of an attack. But if there were an attack, say, on 100 facilities that are in the range of, say, 200 gigawatts, that's a contingency that is so large, especially if the attack were to be simultaneous or nearly simultaneous, that there's not enough reserve capacity, spinning capacity, frequency response in most of the interconnections to prevent a cascading outage. And but nonetheless, in the standards, there are much lower requirements for so-called low-impact facilities, regardless of the number of low-impact facilities that might be simultaneously attacked. So again, the answer to your question really has to do with the physics of the electric grid, the whole interconnection of being connected, and then also just the number of attacks that might occur nearly at the same time.
Very interesting. So, all that being said, and I guess I'm going to go back to some of your earlier comments about the number of incidents that have been reported. So, with no incidents actually being reported for the latest reporting years available, which is 2015 and 16, do you really believe that the added security measures in your proposal are necessary still? Or is it indicative of the lack of real cyber threat reporting from these particular organizations or companies responsible for those particular power generating sources?
The issue of cybersecurity incident reporting has everything to do with the threshold for the reporting. The way the regulatory standard was designed by the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, the bar for reporting is very high. Essentially, there has to be a cybersecurity attack that causes a blackout. I'm simplifying a little bit, but not much. Okay, it has to have a major impact on the operations of the bulk electric system in order to qualify for reporting. So let me give you an alternative example. Suppose there was a phishing attack on the business systems of a major electric utility, and suppose within the business systems, I'm not talking about the operational technology that runs the grid, I'm just talking about the systems that run the business and also may be the repository for the passwords and other credentials for the operational technology. Suppose there was a phishing attack and it resulted in compromise of business systems as well as compromise of passwords and other credentials. And let us further suppose that it would be very complicated to clean up after that compromise in the near term because so many different passwords and credentials were compromised. That incident under the current standard doesn't need to be reported because there's been no impact on the operations of the electric grid. Nonetheless, as long as that malware exists and the compromise has not been mitigated, there is the threat of a blackout. And that is the very important distinction in the current cybersecurity reporting standards.
So it really just boils down to those thresholds and what is considered a cybersecurity incident and what is not. Is that ultimately what?
That's correct. That's correct. The threshold right now is so high for what is a cybersecurity incident, hardly any are being reported. There's thousands of utilities in the United States, and we have less than a handful of these incidents reported every year. I don't find that credible.
So then let's go to ICS CERT with their responding of 79 cybersecurity incidents in 2014 and 46 in 2015. Why is there such a huge variance between these two agencies reporting in their thresholds?
Well, there's a couple reasons. First, we go back to the reason that I just stated. There's a different threshold for reporting. And I think that quite a few of those incidents reported to ICS CERT may be from malware detection vendors, companies like Symantec, that kind of thing. Also, though, let's be very clear about the definitions, because the way my organization works, we always rely on the facts. There's a difference between reporting of incidents for electric utilities and reporting of incidents for the energy sector, because the energy sector is much larger than just electric utilities. There may be cybersecurity incidents reported to ICS CERT by natural gas pipeline operators. There may be incidents reported by refinery operators. So I think that there's the possibility that some of those incidents reported for the energy sector, not all of them are electric utilities. But nonetheless, I do believe that many of them are electric utilities, and the true number of cybersecurity incidents are greater than those that are reported under this very high threshold to NERC and the federal regulators.
So you did mention any malware vendors in your response, and I think it's important for the listeners here to know that ultimately FERC did decline your petition. In spite of having numerous persons and organizations support your petition, including one of those anti-malware vendors. Do you believe there were any ulterior motives for FERC declining your petition and not heeding the advice of some industry experts and top tier anti-malware vendors?
Well, first of all, I want to clarify that there were a number of elements of our petition. So it's malware detection, reporting, removal. The way it worked out, we didn't get the whole loaf that we asked for. We didn't get half a loaf. We got one slice off the loaf. We got FERC did say that there's now an order for a better reporting of cybersecurity incidents. Now, the details of that need to be resolved by the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, and that's problematic because they may write a wishy-washy standard that has a lot of loopholes and exemptions in it, and we'll be back to where we are right now. But it's important to understand that our petition for rulemaking was not turned down in totality. It's just that almost every element of it was turned down, save for improved cybersecurity incident reporting.
Okay, my apologies there then. I misunderstood the final document apparently. So at least we're going to hopefully see some light at the end of the tunnel as far as reporting of these security incidents. There was one very glaring element of the report that I did see that kind of jumped out at me as a InfoSec professional, and that's where you had asserted that the bulk power system assets are interconnected with the public-facing internet. That was just mind-boggling to me. So I have a twofold question for you in that regards. One, how have you obtained and validated this information? And you know, obviously in InfoSec, we have our own means and methods and such, but also what threats do you see arising from that situation?
Certainly. So we have to just visualize for a moment how the electric grid is constructed and what the communication requirements for the electric grid are. So there are generation plants, and then those generation plants produce electricity that goes through a transmission system. There's many substations in the transmission system. All of the generation and transmission are controlled by control rooms. So there must be communication between the control rooms, the substations, the generation facilities. Well, how does that communication take place? Well, there's several ways. Fiber optics, proprietary fiber optic networks that are unconnected to the public internet. I think that would be the most common communication mechanism. There's also microwave, but there can be some use of the public internet. The precise proportion of public internet communications for the commercial electric grid, I don't think anyone knows that. Because there's thousands of utilities, and every single utility would have to be surveyed and have to report accurately that number. Having said that, we do know that the public internet is used in some instances, and we also know that if the exposure to the public internet is severe enough and the facilities are significant enough and the attacks are simultaneous enough, that this could cause a major threat for the electric grid in terms of causing a cascading outage. So it's an excellent question that you ask. What is the magnitude of the threat by interconnection to the public internet? And I have to say, we hope it is not as large as it could be, but from the information sources we have, we do believe it's significant and it's growing at this point.
Gosh, just listening to you talk, I'm sitting here going through my head and thinking, all it takes is a single known vulnerability in a common industrial control system that's in place in one or more of these, facilities, and then doing some, threat intel and research to be able to identify all these systems that are on the public facing internet. And we have tools and resources at our disposal as ethical hackers to be able to identify those systems. And then, if we as ethical hackers have access to that information, so do non-ethical hackers. And for those systems to be public facing does put them and the entire power grid at risk. So that is obviously very alarming. In along those lines, your petition spoke about the vulnerabilities to both systems internal and external to the ESP, or the electronic security perimeter. So, obviously we're not only talking about the public facing internet, but also those systems that are potentially beyond that perimeter network, whether if it be firewalled or what have you. So again, it's just a compounded threat vector that is able to be, compromised and exposed to potential hackers.
Sure. For your audience, which I'm sure many of them are quite sophisticated in terms of cybersecurity and industrial control systems, I think we could all benefit for a little bit more explanation. Certainly the most egregious situation would be to connect the public internet directly to a industrial control system without built-in cybersecurity or authentication. And let's be clear, in many, many cases, I would say even the majority of industrial control systems used in the electric grid have no built-in security whatsoever. Why? Because they were designed to operate in private networks that would never be interconnected with the public internet. In fact, when they were designed, the public internet didn't exist. So that would be the worst situation of all, to have an industrial control system connected to an IP network without any security or authentication. But let us hope that utilities are smarter than that, and that they actually use devices such as a firewall or encryption in between the public internet and, say, the industrial control system, say an RTU at a substation. Then we have to question what's the degree of security provided by that firewall. The disturbing thing is that we know firewalls from major vendors have been compromised, sometimes at the firmware level. And so even having a firewall to establish what's called an electronic security perimeter, that's industry lingo, I should say electric utility industry lingo. Outside of the electric utility industry, I think it'd be called a trust boundary. But even having a firewall it isn't a fail-safe solution. Anytime there's a connection to the public internet, of course, it increases the risk. Even if encryption is used, there's the potential that the passwords or other credentials could be stolen. And I referred to that earlier in terms of penetration or phishing attacks on business systems. So there's a lot of layers to considering this problem and the different vulnerabilities. It's not a simple situation by any means.
Absolutely. And if you look at the recent vulnerabilities from Cisco, Intel, the things with Meltdown and Spectre, these systems that are also embedded with those types of chipsets or dependent on those, layer 2, layer 3 devices that have known vulnerabilities, now all those systems too are at risk. So
that's correct.
Thomas, lastly, and with this question, I'm just going to kind of open it up to you and let you have carte blanche with it, and we'll wrap it up after that. But, kind of open-ended question, what do you feel are the top cyber threats that energy sector CISOs and CSOs should be concerned with in 2018? And do you see FERC slash NERC doing anything to help in those regards?
Certainly. Number one threat is probably supply chain vulnerabilities. Those are vulnerabilities that are in the firmware of equipment used for the electric grid. The vulnerabilities may be inserted in overseas fabrication facilities. FERC is attempting now to have stronger standards for supply chain vulnerabilities. And so we'll give FERC good credit there, and that is a very significant threat. Another threat is what's called remote access. That's really a euphemism for vendors of electric utility equipment economizing by allowing firmware upgrades and other maintenance actions for equipment and substations via connections to the public internet or otherwise. So you just think about it for a moment. There's a bug in some firmware for maybe a circuit breaker in a substation. And if you can think about just the vulnerability of allowing all that firmware to be remotely updated, because if some adversary got a hold of the passwords and that vendor had, say, 50% market share of all circuit breakers, then there's the opportunity for widespread disconnection of load and a cascading outage and that kind of thing. So this remote access vulnerability is really very severe. And then third after that would be the vulnerability that we've talked about, which is malware in business systems, because oftentimes business systems can contain the credentials for the operational technology, or alternatively, there are connections between the business systems and the operational technology. So an intruder can go from the public internet to the business systems, and I would say nearly 100% of business systems are connected to the public internet, and then jump over through those connections, or sometimes firewalls even into the operational technology. So in my mind, those would be really the three major threats that I would see.
Well, thank you for that. And it's kind of interesting that you brought up, the supply chain and vendor management along with remoting. If you look back at the Target breach, that was a perfect example of vendor access being compromised and ultimately resulting in a catastrophic data breach with Target and some 40 million customers, and firing of CEOs and shareholder lawsuits and everything else. So very insightful as far as response to those questions. So thank you again. And Thomas, just thank you for joining today. This has been incredibly eye-opening, and I'm sure all the listeners are going to have questions and concerns about their own environments. Is there anything that you would recommend for follow-up, or anything that any way they can get in touch or involved with your organization?
Well, certainly. I think we have a very informative website, www.resiliencesocieties.org, which keeps the public informed of the various initiatives that we have. And then the last thing I would say to people in industry, don't think that appropriate regulatory standards are necessarily a bad thing, because with appropriate regulatory standards, there's the potential for cost recovery for these security improvements, especially if the industry is regulated. But if there's no regulatory standard, that makes the cost recovery equation a lot more difficult. And so I throw that challenge out there to some of your listeners.
That's a very interesting take on the situation. Do you mind taking just 30 seconds and elaborating on how they might be able to have that cost recovery?
Well, certainly. I can think of several different ways. So if the electric utility equipment is part of the bulk power system, there's opportunities in tariffs that are determined by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission for cost recovery. Also, much of the electric grid is at the distribution level, which is regulated by the states, and so there is opportunity for cost recovery in the tariffs, which are determined by the public utility commissions. So again, it's very important. We know that security is a critical issue, but all that security costs money, and someone has to pay for it. We don't necessarily want all that coming right from the shareholders, especially when the public benefits and could be paying for some of those security improvements through their rates.
Excellent. Thank you for summarizing that. So again, Thomas, thank you for joining us today. And just to reiterate for those listening, Thomas is the chairman and president of the Foundation for Resilient Societies. More information and contact details is available from their website at www.resilientsocieties.com. With that, we're going to go ahead and wrap up this edition of Cyberskills Coach, the Cyberskills Playbook for Business. Thank you for joining us today. It's been a pleasure. Remember, the best defense is a good offense. And with that, we'll stop recording. Stop share. And we are